Welcome to today's podcast of Why We Plan. I'm John Brown, the founder of BEI and the host of this podcast, or the co-host. With us today is a BEI member from the great state of New Hampshire, Joe Guyton. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you.
So how do you have a lot of business? Have you traditionally had a lot of business owner clients?
Yes, I've been in the business 33 years now.
Wow.
I started with Cigna, and we focused on the closely held business owner marketplace. And you're shaking your head because you know that.
Yeah.
We were always, helped to understand that the business owners had a lot of issues that we could help them with, because the fine line between the family and the business in a closely held business. And sometimes that line gets blurred by a lot of different things.
Right.
So I grew up in a closely held business family. My dad owned several businesses. If you ask me who my first exit planning client case study was, not necessarily my client, it was my dad. He sold his businesses in the mid-'80s, and when he was in his mid-'60s, and that was when people were supposed to retire back then. Bottom line is he never should have done it, because it was what kept him busy all the time. It was what stimulated him. It provided the cash flow for the family, it was really the main driver of everything that went on. The business that he sold was the cash cow that was sheltered by the other businesses that he owned that were tax shelters.
Not intentionally?
Well, that was all intentional.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, we were in the horse racing business.
Oh, wow.
And that was a business where the hobby losses and things were taken away by Ronald Reagan in TRA 86. It used to be that we had horses that were racing, that we'd have a partnership that was me and John. The next partnership would be John and me. And the next partnership would be some other combination, and those horses would go from one partnership to the other and be fully depreciated over 3 years. So I like to joke with people that we had a lot of horses that were running around the farm that had been fully depreciated 3 times, but were still eating and requiring a lot of care. So that provided a lot of tax shelter, and they paired, they being his accountant and attorney and so forth, they paired all that stuff together really well. But Reagan took that away in the mid-'80s. My dad sold his businesses in the mid-'80s. We were in the Pittsburgh area, and that area was the Rust Belt in the mid-'80s. And his business was involved in painting steel mills and things like that, which were dying out at the time. And to top it all off, so enough facts for a business exit planning study, right? To top it all off, my mother got cancer, which ultimately killed her.
Wow.
And so my dad got a decent amount of money for his business. I don't think it was enough. Always in hindsight, because I doubt that anybody tried to help him figure out how much he really needed, because I'm sure nobody did.
Well, financial planning was in its infancy back then. Exit planning hadn't started, so where could he go?
Right, exactly. So he didn't get enough money, and then to boot, my mother got sick, and he spent most of it on her experimental cancer treatments. So when she died, he was out his best friend. He was out the person who ran our family. He was out the money that he got for his business and his business. And it was very difficult for him to carry on. And he was not an old man. My dad was, a young man for his age at the time. So when I work with clients, I'll tell people, I say, a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you, and a lot of the recommendations and observations that I make are going to come from what I lived, because despite the fact that all that happened, my dad owned 300 acres of land in western Pennsylvania. My brothers and sisters and I still own most of that land. He used to always say, if we had nothing else, we have the land. It's the most valuable asset we have, and they're not making any more land. We still hear people say that today. Right? The problem was he didn't have any control over when that land was valuable. If it wasn't generating some kind of income, he couldn't collateralize it in any fashion.
Right.
And he didn't have any control over any of that stuff. Well, it turns out there's natural gas under that property. So my brothers and sisters each get a nice annual income from the gas rights under the property. So at the end of the day, my dad was right about all that stuff, but he didn't have any control over it. And again, I tell people, with better planning and with some observations and some things that we can help you with, he could have avoided a lot of that.
So that sounds like that's what generated the interest to do exit planning for you.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's say you're meeting for the first time, or you want to meet for the first time with a business owner in your community. How do you reach out to them, get their attention? Do you use that story, for example?
I'll use that story somewhere along the way in the early stages. When I'm working to engage people, I always like to ask them what they do and what they like about it, and tell me about your business and tell me about your family. All you have to do to get a business owner going is ask him about his business, because most of them love their business, which is why they did it in the first place.
Right. How do you find them to talk to them? How do you get their attention?
Well, a lot of different ways. We operate, in a relatively small town. So, we know a lot of people through social interaction, whether it be at a club, whether it be at, some kind of charitable organizations. So it's not difficult in many respects to meet people. The next step then is to engage them and get them talking about things. And once you have, that level of interest, you can start to talk about, maybe we could talk about the next thing. A couple of years ago, we did a nice case with a fellow who had come to one of our social functions, and we started engaging him, and he had some questions about a couple of things that he'd heard about and was curious about. And so we talked a little bit about that stuff, and I looked at him and I said, why don't you just come in and we'll sit down and we can answer those questions and see if we can be helpful to you. And one thing led to another, and we did some work for him, and we're continuing to do some work as we go forward.
So how do you do that work? Because you're a financial and insurance advisor, but these people need a lot more than financial and insurance. They need a whole plan to get out of their business. Oh, absolutely. And so what we talk to them about is all the different things that they need to do around that. Now, before I, became affiliated with BEI, we would work with the attorneys and accountants and identify buy-sells and say you need to have your estate plan updated and things of that nature. And now we have a much better structure for all that. And what we do now is we use the assessments with people, and start with the the circle chart that comes from the assessment, because those big red lines jump right out at people, and you say, if you're planning to accomplish a given goal, you're going to need to address this issue in order to do that. And it's the owner who's identified that issue, not you.
Yes.
Which is critical, I think, in that whole process.
Well, and that's just it. It's like, sometimes they look at that and they kind of take a step back and say, well, I guess we have some work to do.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say that concern the owner has nothing to do with business continuity, estate planning. It might be a management team issue. So as you proceed helping them, how do you deal with that specific issue?
Once we identify the issue, we start thinking about who we know in our network that can help them. If it's a management team issue, it could be human resources, / ERISA-related items. It could be training and attracting, recruiting, retaining. So deferred compensation.
So you've created a team of other advisors apart from your company that will come in, be retained by the owner, and you will facilitate that whole process. I'm assuming.
Yeah. We'll make the referrals and the introductions to get them the expertise they need.
That's great. It's too bad your dad didn't have that, right?
It really is. But I often say to people, things have changed a lot in that time period. And my mother had melanoma cancer, and I tell people all the time, she died at 64. Yeah. And I tell people all the time, if she were alive today, she'd have a chronic disease, not a death sentence.
Right, right.
And so we bring the new things that we've learned, the new tools and techniques to bear and help people with them.
That's great. That's great. How has your reception been in the community? Are you starting to become recognized as the visible expert in exit planning?
Yes, I think we're making some inroads into that and helping our network of other advisors understand what we do and what we can offer. And quite frankly, we're learning and trying to get better at getting that message out every day as we go along.
Excellent. What else about your practice, Joe, would be of value for the listener to understand?
I think the most valuable thing for a listener to understand about us is, in my practice in particular, is I grew up in it. I've been in it my whole life.
Yeah.
And my son has too. He got up in front of an organization that we belong to give a short presentation a couple of years ago, and he said, my name is Andrew Guyton. And I've been in this business for 32 years. And he's 32 years old.
Yeah.
So we offer that to people because it is a culture unto itself. Mm-hmm. There are things that go on in family businesses, not just economically and financially, but emotionally.
Sure.
That we understand because we've lived all of it.
So when you have a family business as a client, mm-hmm. I assume that's maybe your area of concentration or where you like to work.
Yes.
How do you represent a family?
Well, you do it with and be as impartial as possible. Mm-hmm. You recognize that the founder has goals and objectives and needs, and the successors have goals and objectives and needs. Mm-hmm. And that the successors in the business are different than the children who are not in the business. And what we always do is we start with the founders. It's about you.
Right.
You founded this business. You worked your whole life to build it. You took care of your family with it. And now it's your time to exit and enjoy the next chapter of your life. We never call it retirement because to us it's just another chapter. Mm-hmm. So you want to enjoy the next chapter of your life, and it's your turn to do that. And so we're going to make sure that everything is as focused on you as possible, and that your objectives relative to succession, your children, your family are met within the framework of what's best for you.
And that's great. That is very consistent. It's the same as the fundamental mission of exit planning, of BEI, which is to help owners benefit from their life's work, which is to understand their wants and needs and make sure that that's attained.
Right.
It's the owner first, even in a family-owned business.
Has to be.
It has to be.
Right.
But so many people, even owners, don't look at it that way. It's
right.
like, oh, I need to exit, but really this child needs to be taken care of, or we've got to do this for this other family member. They can all be accomplished, but it has to be, I think, done with the understanding that it's the owner's goals that have to also be reached, the financial goals and the other goals that they have.
Absolutely. Well, and one of the things that we like to say to people is we're going to plan for you to live to be 100. The most frequent response we get to that is usually some kind of an eye roll or a shrug. Yeah. I don't want to do that. And I always smile at them and say, well, what are you going to do about it? Right? Yeah. Because people will say to me, I'm not living past 90. And I say, listen, I'll only put together a plan for you that ends when you're 90 if you promise to cooperate. Right? Which, yeah. You make a little bit light of it because people don't understand what they're saying.
They don't understand life expectancies today. So,
right.
I read a study, I guess it was, that said if you're husband and wife, you're married, it's sort of regardless of the ages, but so say they're approximately the same. But this is true if you're 60 or 70 or 50. There's about a 50% probability that one of you will live to age 95.
And we point that out to people, and we also talk to them about something else that they don't think about, which is if they're happily married, if they have financial security, if they're well educated, if they have a family around them who cares for them, and they have access to knowledge and health care and things like that, that they are a subset of the greater population who is likely to live longer than everybody else, because if you have all those things, you generally have a relatively peaceful, stress-free life that brings you a lot of gratification and blessings. And that in and of itself allows you to live longer.
That's great. Yeah, I agree 100%.
It's an interesting concept.
Yeah, it is. Well, I think it's probably a fact.
It is a fact.
I think it's probably a fact.
Yeah.
That's great. Anything else?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, Joe is a great example of why we plan.